this thing on? Yes, hello? Okay, it's on. Right, so let's continue and build the next part here. So if you think, let me just turn the camera around and explain something here. If I just start off by moving this back. If you think of this as a handle, think of the cursor as your controller that you want to grab this with. So whenever I move my hand over to it, we should have a hover event. So we need to implement a bunch of hover events, so hover begin and hover end, to give the user some kind of feedback that, okay, now it's usable and now it's not. And also, if this is, let's say if it's slider back and forth, then we might want to have a minimum and maximum, so some kind of limit, and we want to have events whenever we hit one of these limits, so the 0 or whatever it is. So these two things are pretty fundamental to this setup here. So we're going to add this into the BP mover blueprint here. So first of all, we're going to expand the iMovable actor with the new events. Mover at minimum, I'm going to call them. I tried to come up with better names, but mover at max, and then mover hover begin and mover hover end. So these 4 extra events we want to do something with. Now the static mesh component is the one that we usually want to interact with. Oh, and by the way, I also changed a little bit extra, so I need to do something more. Inside my motion controller, this is definitely not something that you need to do, but I just thought it was a perfect, splendid idea, so that's why I did it. If we look at inside the the motion controller somewhere, yeah, grab actor. We have this function called get actor near hand, and I modified that a little bit to check overlapping components instead of overlapping actors. So that just gives me a little bit better control over what I pick up, and then I check if this component has a specific tag. So in this case, it's called interaction handle. So I need, in order to be able to move anything with this, I need to add this tag to this component here. So I'm going to add this down here. Okay. So that means also one, that was actually not related, by the way. On begin overlap and on end overlap, we want to do something about this. So hit these two things here and say whenever we begin or end overlap, then we want to raise some new events. So we're going to make them now on hover begin and hover end. Like this, and we're just going to do it exactly the same way as before. So this is super boring stuff. Mover hover begin. If you're wondering why I do it from the end, do this one first, it's because I then get the correct message method versus trying to get it from the self node here instead. For some reason it doesn't show up. So move hover end like this. All right, that's all we need to do for the hover events. So while we're in here and on it, we might as well also just make, do I call them on minimum? Yeah, we're gonna call on minimum, on mover minimum. Shitty name. Did I call something? No, I called it on min. Omen. Okay, now that's totally not funny. Okay, and we're gonna keep doing this. Over at max. And over at min. Like this. So now we have these guys ready. Okay, so now we just need to figure out when to call them. Well, the hover events we already know, so it's going to be here. So on begin overlap, we're going to call on hover begin, and on hover end, we're going to call down here. So that makes it possible to, for example, change the color, do a little rumble, make a little puff of particles or whatever whenever we hover our hand over this static mesh here. So the on minimum and on maximum, that require a few things more that we don't have right now. So we're gonna add in a value to begin with. Like this. And we're going to add in a limit. Okay, so the limit limit is the maximum the value can be. Is that a shitty description? Well, it should be pretty obvious what it does. And the value is the current. It's just the current value. Is grab, that is something we already said. So here's the thing. I'm gonna make a design decision here. I'm not gonna allow having negative limits. So that means that when I set a limit, I require this to be a positive value, because if I set it to 0, I came out wrong. So sorry. If I set it to 0, okay, then it will probably mean that I do not want this to move. Could be. I mean, I could also just say if the limit is 0, then it doesn't have a limit. Nah. I can't really decide what I like the best. I do like the best to have a boolean for this. Has limit like this. Okay, so so if this is true, the limit is the max the value can be. Oh, Jesus Christ. Let me just check 1 second what I wrote last time. That was the worst description ever. I'm just going to copy that stuff because I just happen to have it on the other screen. A few pieces of what I already did. As limit. Okay, so it says true of if true if limit should be enforced. Okay, and limit is the maximum the value can be. Let me just check what I had for that. Okay, I actually added something other to this. I'm just going to copy that in. It's just going to be so much better. This point here. It says, you cannot see this, I just realized. Great. Well, I'm just going to read it out. Limit of value must be positive and only has an effect if has limit is true. That was way better. As I said, I've done this before. My head was way more clear back then. So that means that we have a few things now. While we're doing this, the limit, let's move some of this stuff. The grab is going to be something I'm going to put in a category called internal, because it's something that we don't necessarily want to see. The value is going to be visible, public, and I'm going to keep it at the default. And the limit, going to be adding a settings group, like that. So that means that when also going to make this public. So whenever we add this, all of these three should be public. So whenever we add this a child of this type here to our scene, then we can modify these and change them on the run. It's just going to be way more convenient for us. So now we have a way of starting to build this this logic here. A few things we should do inside the construction script. I just realized it's probably a good time to do right now. If we at this point here were to drag out our new and super object here, right now it looks pretty boring, it doesn't have any mesh or anything, but if we were to type in -50, it would just do it. And if I were to type in something like this, that would also be accepted, and has limit doesn't do anything, all that stuff. So we definitely want to make sure that when we design this, that it's not going to allow whoever uses this to input weird stuff. So I'm going to add some stuff to the construction script here. So to begin with, I want to make sure that I want to make a check. If the has limit is set to true, if this, Jesus Christ, if this is true, okay, then we want to enforce the whatever value we have. So we want to get the value and we want to clamp this to be within the limit. Like this, and then we want to set the value to that. So that way, whenever we type in anything outside the range, it's going to get clamped within that. So right now the limit is allowed to be negative, so we're also going to change that as well, as I said. So let's do a, did I make a sequence here? Yes, I did. Yes, I did. Actually, I made a big sequence. So we're going to drag this down here, and we're going to make first a check on on the limit. So the limit, if this is less than 0, then we're going to set it to 0. This, no. Like this. So now if you type in, oops, something like this, you can see it's getting clamped, but if I type in minus something, then both the value and the limit gets clamped. If I type in don't have limit, and then I can type in whatever, but as soon as I check this, it's gonna clamp this within this range here. So this seems to be working pretty good at this point here. Okay, what else do we have? Okay. On minimum and maximum, we still need to raise these two events here. And we actually need to do that on event tick. We want to make sure that none of this stuff here being executed on the event, as little as possible is getting executed on event tick, because yeah, of course it's going to take our performance. So we're going to start out by checking has limit, is this true? And if this is true, then we can just copy this stuff here, because we don't want to type that again. We want to make sure first of all that the value is getting clamped within the range. It's super important. We don't want it to go outside the bounds. If it's a physics object, maybe you could think of a situation where it could land outside its range. So we want to make sure that at every time that this is getting put inside this range here. And then we also want to do some other stuff, and I think I'm gonna do another sequence. I like sequences, even though they can be a little bit confusing sometimes. Whoopsies. So I'm just gonna move this stuff up here like this, and then we're gonna do a check. You know what? I'm going to make another sequence, and then I'm going to collapse this to a collapse the nodes afterwards, because we're going to do a check first here. Is the value, if this is equal to 0, and we can get away with checking exactly because we just clamped the value, so we know that if it was less than 0, then it would get clamped because we just did that. So if this is equal to 0, then it's at the minimum. So technically we just call this. But what will happen is that when we start the game, or yeah, well, if it is at minimum, it's going to be constantly at minimum, and we're not going to be interested in that. So this is just going to fire non-stop, basically. So we're going to guard this with a do once. Like this, and only execute this once. And let's also introduce another internal variable here to keep check of if we are at minimum or at maximum. Like this. So these values are just going to be convenient for us if we need to ask, is this on or off or not. We can always check the value, see what it is, and compare that with something, but it's just convenient if you want to expose this kind of stuff here. So we're going to set these two. Is at minimum, it's going to be true when we hit this part here, And we need to figure out when to set this back again. So I'm just going to make a little more space here. So the thing is, once the value gets above a certain threshold, then we can say, okay, if you move it to 0 and then move it back a little bit and then to 0, then we want to fire it again. But if it's 0 non-stop, then we don't want to fire it again. Since we're going to be making some of this stuff using a physics objects, then there can be some slight variations. So I'm going to add in a kind of a limit. Say, okay, if it's greater than 1, and I'm just picking this at random. So if obviously if your limit is also 1, then this is going to fall apart. But you're not going to do that anyway. Hopefully. And in that case, maybe you want to make, if this is greater than a percentage of something. So if this is, whoops, greater than, I meant 1, then we're going to set it back to not at minimum, and we're going to reset this again. So this was the minimum part. So the maximum part is going to be very similar to that. We're going to branch off here and say, is this equal to the limit? And if it is, then we're going to set is at max to be true. And here we're going to set it to false. And we're not going to fire on minimum, we're going to fire on maximum. And also we are gonna subtract, what did I do here? Okay, we set something like this. That was easier. The limit minus the value, yeah, of course. I think I'm tired, something. So if the limit minus the value is greater than 1, then we moved it back a little bit, and then we say we're ready to fire one of these events again. Otherwise not. So there's one thing we also need to take care of. It's this start closed. So when we start out, it might be at minimum to begin with, and we may not want to have this event, especially for example if it's a sound event that you're playing. It's gonna say click or something the first time you start playing, and you may not be interested in that. So we're gonna set this based off this is at minimum. So if this is at minimum, then if it is already at minimum, we're going to start closed. That means that first time it's going to hit this one, it's not going to pass. And if it starts at maximum, then it's not going to start firing this one off anyway to begin with. That should be it. We don't do anything with the value itself yet. So none of this stuff that we built so far is gonna work yet. But well, we're getting there, and it will soon be visible why we are doing all this stuff here. So I'm just gonna end this video by selecting everything and collapse this and call this delegate min and max events. Could also, this is so little, so it's going to be okay to have here. Compile and save, and we still don't really see anything, but we're going to do that very shortly. I think that's it for this video. I hope you've been able to follow along, and I hope you will soon be able to see where I'm going with this. So stay tuned and see you in the next.